They say real monsters don't hide in shadows. They hide in suits, in boardrooms, in the smooth confidence of a voice that sounds like opportunity. Before you hear the story of how one man manipulated an entire generation of dreamers, stole millions from hardworking families, and somehow walked away as a celebrity, let me warn you, this is not the Hollywood version. This is the true horror. Beneath the glitter, the blood behind the money, the victims behind the punchlines. So, before we dive into the empire of lies Jordan Belfort built, and the even darker truth of why the world still worships him, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because what you're about to hear will change the way you see every success story you've ever admired. Queens, New York, 1962, a neighborhood of brick houses, modest hopes, and people who believed hard work could still buy a future. But among them was a boy who believed in something entirely different, not effort, not honesty, but leverage. Even as a kid, Jordan didn't chase fairness, he chased angles. When other teenagers pushed lawnmowers or bagged groceries, he was testing the psychology of desire, selling lemon ices 2 for $1, but only if customers told 3 friends. It wasn't about dessert, it was about influence. And by the end of that summer, the 16-year-old had pocketed $20,000, not through brilliance, but through instinct, the instinct of a predator learning its hunger. Most kids would have used that money to buy a Camaro or at least a few glimpses of teenage rebellion. Not Jordan. He walked into dental school, sat down, listened to the dean say, "If you're here to get rich, you're in the wrong profession," and walked right back out. No hesitation, no contemplation. Because deep inside, he already knew he wasn't built for professions. He was built for loopholes. And dentistry had no room for loopholes. So he did what every dreamer without morals eventually does. He went hunting for the next opportunity to bend reality to his will. That opportunity arrived in the form of a door-to-door meat and seafood business. Not glamorous, not clean, and definitely not legal in the way Jordan operated it. He sold USDA prime cuts from the back of a car that doubled as a freezer and, when necessary, a trash can. Deliveries were late invoices unpaid, and steaks often half-thawed and sweating under the summer sun. Yet somehow, in the middle of the chaos, the business pulled in $100,000 a month on pure charisma alone. But charisma can't refrigerate beef, and soon, angry customers, spoiled shipments, and logistical nightmares crushed the entire operation. The company collapsed. Jordan did not. Because in the ashes of that failure, he discovered something terrifying. The product had never mattered. Not the meat, not the quality, not the logistics. The only thing that mattered was the pitch, his voice, his ability to talk faster than doubt, louder than reason, smoother than conscience. And once he recognized that skill, he realized something else. The world was full of people desperate enough to trust anyone who sounded certain. Jordan didn't need a better business. He needed a bigger stage. That stage was Wall Street. The 1980s were a fever dream of greed, cocaine, neon-lit ambition, and money that evaporated as quickly as it appeared. Jordan landed a job at L.F. Rothschild, a real firm with real power, real prestige, and a bathroom stall supply of narcotics that could fuel 3 generations of poor decisions. There, he learned the movement of markets, the rhythm of brokers, and the truth that would define his life. Confidence sells faster than facts. He studied not stocks, but behavior, how fear made people irrational, how greed made them obedient, and how the right tone of voice could silence every instinct humans evolved for self-protection. Then came black. Monday, October 1987, phones died. Brokers stared at collapsing tickers like men watching their futures evaporate. Millions disappeared in hours. For Jordan, the lesson wasn't that the market was dangerous. It was that vulnerability could be monetized. When others saw disaster, he saw leverage. When others panicked, he prepared. And when he got fired, he didn't grieve, he pivoted toward something far less respectable and far more profitable. That something was penny stocks, pink sheet garbage nobody on real Wall Street would touch. Illiquid, unregulated, unknown companies worth pennies and usually destined to stay that way. But they came with a hidden treasure, 50% commissions. Sell $1 stock, keep half, sell it with the right level of confidence, and your client wouldn't even realize they'd bought a fantasy. Jordan picked up a phone, called a man in Nebraska, fed him dreams of a ground floor opportunity, and closed $4,000 in minutes. Same pitch as Wall Street. 10 times the payout, 0 rules. And Jordan realized he didn't need Wall Street. He could build his own. In 1989, he found the perfect partner for this new empire, a man named Danny Perush. Danny wasn't polished. He wasn't stable. Some days he didn't even seem fully tethered to reality. But he had something more valuable, the hunger of a man who believed morality was a suggestion. Jordan had calculation. Danny had chaos. Together they were invincible. Together, they would build something that sounded like a century-old institution and looked on paper like a fortress of financial genius. In reality, it was a strip mall boiler room with cheap desks, buzzing fluorescent lights, and absolutely no regulatory oversight. They called it Stratton Oakmont. The first recruits weren't graduates of finance programs or analysts with experience. They were bartenders, dropouts, neighborhood hustlers, people who had never been respected enough to question orders. And that was exactly what Jordan wanted. He didn't need thinkers. He needed closers. He trained them not in finance, but in obedience, teaching them a method he called straight line persuasion. It wasn't sales training, it was psychological conditioning, a system designed to bulldoze hesitation, override instinct, and force a stranger from hello to where do I send the check in one uninterrupted line. The boiler room became a factory, and these men, desperate for approval, became his perfect soldiers. Soon the room pulsed with a rhythm that didn't feel like finance, it felt like war. Phones rang in frantic unison. Recruits shouted scripts until their voices cracked, their desperation turning into something sharper, something weaponized. Jordan stalked the sales floor like a general surveying a battlefield, correcting posture, tone, pacing, breathing. The atmosphere was electric, addictive, dangerous. Every completed sale was met with thunderous applause. Every failure was publicly humiliated. Stratton Oakmont was no longer a brokerage. It was an indoctrination center where hesitation was weakness and empathy was treason. And Jordan, with his slicked back hair and icy smile, became less a boss and more a cult leader. But the real genius, the real horror wasn't in how Stratton sold, but who they sold to. Wall Street ignored the working class because they offered small accounts. Jordan targeted them precisely because they offered small accounts. A retired school teacher with $10,000. Perfect. A war veteran hoping to invest his life savings. Even better, a single mother trying to secure a future for her kids. Jackpot. These people trusted enthusiasm. They trusted expertise. They trusted voices that sounded like they knew more than they did. And Jordan knew exactly how to sound like salvation to people who didn't even realize they were drowning. At first, the stocks they pushed were nearly worthless penny shares of companies that existed only in press releases and vague promises. But as Stratton Oakmont grew, so did the ambition of its crimes. They moved from obscure pink sheet garbage to real IPOs, real companies, real markets. Jordan would quietly buy millions of cheap shares, then set the sales floor loose like a pack of wolves chasing fresh blood. Dozens of brokers called the same targets using the same scripts, promising the same explosive growth. The artificially inflated demand skyrocketed the stock price. Then at the peak, at the exact moment the victims believed they were finally about to make it, Jordan dumped everything. The stock collapsed. Their dreams collapsed with it. Inside Stratton Oakmont, these events weren't tragedies, they were celebrations. Jordan called them Tuesday. And Tuesday often came with champagne showers, air horns, and stacks of cash thrown across the room like confetti. Brokers danced on desks. Women were hired not for spreadsheets, but for spectacle. Cocaine lines were drawn across compliance manuals like white slashes of irony. Every moral boundary dissolved under the heat of adrenaline. To newcomers, it felt like a fever dream. To veterans, it felt like oxygen. In that twisted kingdom, excess wasn't the reward, it was the culture. The more money poured in, the more distorted reality became. The office transformed into a carnival designed by someone who mistook corruption for energy. Lunch breaks involved dwarf-tossing contests and impromptu wrestling matches. There were brawls over commissions, screaming matches over women, and drug-induced meltdowns that ended with employees twitching on the salesroom carpet. Jordan watched it all from his glass office, the eye of a hurricane built entirely from human weakness. He encouraged the chaos because chaos made people loyal. When a man feels he's part of something wild, untouchable, larger than life, he stops questioning the morality of the engine powering it. Jordan's own life mirrored the insanity he created. He bought mansions with marble floors that echoed with late-night parties. He collected cars like trophies, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, anything that could scream his ego across the highway. His yacht, an obscene monument to self-worship, was named after his wife, Naomi, though fidelity had long been a corpse in their marriage. He traveled by helicopter just because he could. Each new luxury convinced him of his own invincibility. And invincibility, when mixed with an addict's cocktail of cocaine and quaaludes, becomes something more dangerous than greed. It becomes delusion. He began operating in a haze, switching from high-octane arrogance to quaalude-slowed stupor within the same afternoon. Associates recalled conversations where Jordan slurred his words so heavily they wondered if he was conscious. Other times he was an unstoppable tornado of manic clarity, shouting orders, demanding sales, punishing weakness. The drugs weren't a side effect, they were fuel. They allowed him to function in a world built on lies, pressure, and constant overstimulation. They dulled guilt, erased caution, and inflated his sense of destiny. Jordan wasn't just high, he was untouchable, or so he believed. But cracks began to form. Investors complained. Stocks collapsed without explanation. Journalists sniffed around Stratton Oakmont's miracle growth. And inside the firm, even the most loyal brokers began whispering. They were pushing stocks with no products, no revenue, no phone numbers that worked. The official explanation from management was simple. Don't think. Close, but doubt spreads like a virus, and the air inside Stratton Oakmont became thick with paranoia. The louder Jordan celebrated success, the more obvious it became that something was rotting beneath the marble floors and ejector seat ego. The rot only accelerated as Stratton expanded. Money laundering became a daily task rather than an emergency measure. Jordan funneled millions offshore through shell companies registered to relatives, friends, and sometimes strangers who didn't even know their names were being used. At one point, he paid a housekeeper to carry envelopes of cash across borders, the bills taped beneath her clothes. He called it asset protection. The FBI called it something else. Journalists called it suspicious. And Naomi, his wife, called it insanity, as she found syringes, pills, and traces of white powder hidden around their home. The breaking point came not from the FBI, not from the SEC, but from Jordan himself. One night, so high on Quaaludes he could barely form a sentence, he attempted to drive his white Ferrari home. He didn't make it. He crashed into a stone pillar with such force that the car folded like wet paper. In the passenger seat was his 3-year-old daughter. She survived. But that incident, quietly buried at the time, revealed the truth. Jordan wasn't merely reckless. He was a man whose addiction, arrogance, and delusions had grown so monstrous that even the innocent were collateral damage. And the walls around his empire were finally beginning to close in. The morning after the crash, Jordan acted as though nothing had happened. That was his nature. Catastrophes evaporated the second they threatened his self-image. Yet the people around him saw what he refused to acknowledge. His wife Naomi watched her once charming husband morph into a creature of mood swings, violent outbursts, and frightening hallucinations. Employees whispered about his increasingly unhinged behavior, paranoid rants about regulators, manic declarations of invincibility, and impulsive orders that made no financial sense. What the world saw as a glamorous wolf was up close a man unraveling beneath the weight of his addictions and the very empire he had built on lies. But the most symbolic collapse happened in the summer of 1996 aboard his beloved yacht, the same yacht he foolishly named after Naomi despite betraying her relentlessly. Against the captain's desperate warnings, Jordan insisted they sail into a Mediterranean storm. He was high drunk and in the mood to prove that even nature obeyed him. It did not. The waves pummeled the vessel until it began sinking in open water. For a brief moment, as the yacht groaned and tilted, Jordan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear, the kind that strips away ego. Inside the cabin were his wife, his daughter, millions in jewelry, and a stash of narcotics. The Italian Navy rescued them in the final moments. The yacht didn't survive. Jordan barely did. It was the first omen that his empire was not immortal. Back in the United States, the pressure around Stratton Oakmont tightened like a noose. Investigative journalists from Forbes and the Wall Street Journal began publishing stories hinting at fraud, manipulation, and suspicious trading patterns. Investors who once laughed with brokers now called in tears, demanding answers. Regulators filed inquiries. But the real threat came from a man the world barely knew at the time, FBI agent Gregory Coleman. Unlike the journalists who worked with speculation, Coleman built cases brick by brick, methodically, quietly, with the patience of someone who understood that predators often expose themselves if watched long enough. And Jordan was exposing himself daily. Coleman subpoenaed wire transfers, interviewed former employees, and followed the money trails Jordan believed were invisible. He noticed that Jordan withdrew cash in patterns, $50,000 at a time, converted into cashier's checks, and recirculated through casinos, jewelry stores, and obscure art galleries. He traced accounts in Switzerland, the Caymans, and even the UK, under the name of Jordan's elderly aunt. The deeper Coleman dug, the clearer the picture became. Stratton Oakmont wasn't just committing fraud. It was laundering money through a network of sham corporations, offshore banks, and trusted accomplices who didn't understand the danger until it was too late. Inside Stratton, the paranoia became unbearable. Brokers who once worshipped Jordan now feared a future where Loyalty meant prison. One employee caught in a separate fraud case flipped almost immediately, offering tapes, documents, and testimony. Another, furious over an unpaid bonus, walked straight into the FBI's office. Coleman didn't need to pressure them. Their guilt and Jordan's willingness to sacrifice anyone to protect himself did the work for him. Soon wires were worn, conversations recorded, files smuggled out in briefcases. Every loud celebration inside Stratton echoed in Coleman's quiet office as another nail in Jordan's coffin. Then came the day that would be remembered as the moment the wolf finally faced the hunters. October 1996, just after sunrise, federal agents stormed Stratton Oakmont. The chaos inside was instant and surreal, like a surrealist painting of panic. Phones were ripped from desks. Wall posters about success and hunger were torn down. Employees were separated, questioned, and watched with cold, expressionless eyes. One man tried to flush incriminating documents down a toilet until the bowl overflowed. Another attempted to carry a briefcase filled with shredded contracts out the side door, only to be caught within seconds. The empire that once felt untouchable now looked pathetic paper noise and desperation. The seizure of files, computers, and phone logs was devastating for Stratton, but what broke the company beyond repair happened months later. In early 1997, during the investigation, Jordan made the fatal mistake that exposed his arrogance more than any sales script ever could. Despite being explicitly ordered not to move funds, he wired $2 million to Switzerland using the same channels Coleman had already mapped. Worse, he discussed the transfer on a recorded line. That single decision became the thread that unraveled everything. It proved he knew what he was doing was illegal. It proved intent. It proved guilt. By late 1998, the FBI, SEC, and federal prosecutors had everything: the recordings, the forged documents, the testimonies from former employees. The narrative Hollywood would later glamorize as ambition gone wild was in reality an airtight case of manipulation and theft. Jordan Belfort was cornered out of money, out of moves, and out of lies, believable enough to survive scrutiny. He faced up to 30 years in prison. 30 years for crimes that destroyed retirement accounts, emptied college funds, and robbed families of the futures they'd worked decades for. It should have been a fitting sentence for a man who had treated trust like currency and morality like inconvenience. But Jordan Belfort, even trapped, remained a salesman. When survival demanded loyalty, he betrayed his partners. When justice demanded accountability, he negotiated. He agreed to cooperate. He wore a wire. He handed over people who had idolized him, imitated him, followed his footsteps, and trusted he would protect them. Over 30 employees were indicted, some fresh out of high school when they joined Stratton, still young enough to believe the world was fair. Many served longer sentences than Jordan himself. The wolf did what wolves do. He saved himself and let the pack burn. When sentencing finally arrived, the world expected a cautionary tale. Instead, they got a parody of justice. Jordan received 22 months, not in a maximum security prison, not in a place where danger lurked around every corner, but in a minimum security facility often compared to a college campus. No fences, no guns, no real consequences. He played tennis in the mornings, lifted weights in the afternoons, and at night, surrounded by quiet hallways and soft lights, he wrote. Many inmates wrote out of regret or redemption. Jordan wrote to monetize his sins. He wrote because one day he planned to turn his crimes into entertainment, and the world disturbingly would reward him for it. In that quiet prison, Jordan met someone who would alter the trajectory of his life far more than the FBI ever did. Tommy Chong, the comedian, serving time for selling bongs online. To Jordan, Tommy was an amusing distraction, someone to impress with exaggerated war stories of yachts, drugs, money laundering, and sales so manipulative they bordered on hypnosis. He recounted his life not with shame, but with pride, shaping the narrative like a stand-up routine. Instead of disgust, Tommy laughed. And his laughter became gasoline poured over the embers of Jordan's ego. Write it down, he told him. People will want to hear this. And just like that, Jordan began crafting not a confession, but a myth. As the pages piled up, Jordan realized something he had always suspected. People are more fascinated by charismatic villains than by genuine heroes. He didn't need redemption. He needed a good story. So he exaggerated, embellished, polished the edges of his crimes until they gleamed like diamonds. The fraud became adventure. The addictions became humor. The victims became footnotes. By the time he walked out of prison, manuscript in hand, he was no longer a disgraced broker. He was an entertainer preparing for his second act, and he had spent 22 months rehearsing every line. In 2007, The Wolf of Wall Street was published. Critics called it outrageous, shocking, obscene, and brilliant. The public devoured it, intoxicated by the glamour of excess and the voyeuristic thrill of watching a criminal narrate his own downfall with smug self-awareness. There were no apologies in those pages, no efforts to humanize the people he destroyed. Instead, the book reveled in the chaos, glorifying the wolf rather than mourning his prey. And the most disturbing part wasn't Jordan's tone, it was the audience's reaction. People loved it, they loved him. The criminal had become a celebrity. But fame didn't stop there. Hollywood came knocking, drawn by a narrative dripping with decadence, danger, and dark comedy. Martin Scorsese signed on to direct. Leonardo DiCaprio agreed to play Jordan, spending months studying his mannerisms, his voice, his swagger. The film wasn't just a retelling, it was a transformation. In Scorsese's hands, Jordan's crimes became cinematic spectacle. In DiCaprio's hands, Jordan became magnetic, intoxicating, irresistibly watchable. Millions watched a man destroy lives and laughed. They cheered. They mimicked his quotes. The wolf wasn't being condemned. He was being immortalized. But behind the laughter and applause, behind the award nominations and memes, there was a reality. Hollywood ignored the victims, the elderly woman whose retirement vanished, the veteran whose life savings evaporated overnight, the single father who refinanced his home to invest in the next big thing. Their pain didn't make it into the movie. Their ruined futures weren't cinematic enough. While theaters echoed with cheers, their living rooms echoed with silence, an emptiness shaped by choices they made only because they trusted a voice on the phone. When the film premiered in 2013, Jordan walked the red carpet wearing a smile that would have made even the FBI agents who arrested him clench their teeth. Reporters asked him about his past, and he brushed it aside with charm, turning fraud into anecdote manipulation into entertainment. Flashbulbs popped, and for a moment, the world forgot or chose to forget that this man owed over $100 million in restitution, a debt ordered by the court, a debt he had barely begun to pay. But Hollywood wasn't interested in accountability. It was interested in profits. And Jordan, as always, knew how to capitalize on that. After the movie's release, Jordan reinvented himself again, this time as a motivational speaker. He traveled the world teaching sales ethics and success principles as though he had become a reformed guru. Audiences flocked to him, paying thousands to hear the wolf explain how to become the shepherd. They laughed at his stories, applauded his confidence, and admired the very personality traits that once helped him steal from ordinary people. He sold out theaters, he built online programs, he hosted podcasts, and through it all, he wore the title, The Wolf, as a badge of honor, not a scar. But while Jordan grew richer, the victims grew older. Some lost homes they never rebuilt, others retired into poverty, many died waiting for the restitution they were promised. The government ordered him to pay back $110 million, yet the payments trickled in like raindrops on a desert rock. Court documents later revealed how money slipped through loopholes, trusts, offshore accounts, how Jordan's lifestyle often seemed more comfortable than that of an ordinary working citizen. The legal system demanded repayment. Jordan demanded applause. And the more the public embraced him, the more he leaned into the persona. In interviews, he framed himself as a misunderstood rebel, a flawed genius, a man who made mistakes but learned from them. Rarely did he mention the people he ruined. Rarely did he acknowledge the magnitude of his crimes. Instead, he joked about Quaaludes, about sinking the yacht, about the excess. Every punchline erased a little more of the truth. Every laugh normalized the tragedy. In the end, the world didn't rehabilitate him. It rewarded him. And perhaps the darkest twist of all is not what Jordan did, but what society did after it chose him. We collectively elevated a fraudster into cultural royalty, turning his crimes into entertainment and his victims into shadows. His memoir became a bestseller. His movie became a blockbuster. His speeches became sold-out events. Somewhere along the way, the wolf stopped being a warning and became a fantasy, a symbol of the life people wanted but would never admit. And this, more than any fraud he ever committed, is the ultimate horror. Jordan Belfort didn't just escape justice. He became a mirror reflecting the greed people secretly admire. But beneath the glittering stage lights where Jordan sold his reinvention, a harsher truth began haunting the people who had watched this spectacle unfold. If a man could destroy lives, betray friends, launder millions, mock the justice system, and still emerge as a charismatic millionaire, then what did that say about the society? Applauding him, Jordan became more than a criminal. He became a symptom, a reflection of a cultural sickness in which charm outweighs conscience and entertainment buries accountability. His story revealed not the brilliance of a wolf, but the blindness of a world that forgets too quickly and forgives too easily. During private interviews, years later, some former Stratton brokers admitted they still dreamed about the chaos of the sales floor, the adrenaline, the camaraderie, the delusion that they were invincible. Others confessed they couldn't sleep because of the faces of people they'd scammed, voices trembling through phone calls that wouldn't leave their minds. One broker said he still remembered a retired woman breaking down in tears when she realized her life savings were gone. Jordan told us not to think about it, he whispered. So we didn't, until it was too late. That sentence became the unofficial epitaph of an entire generation. Manipulated by Belfort's charisma, they didn't think until it was too late. Meanwhile, Jordan appeared on talk shows, podcasts, and stages with a grin that never faltered. When asked about his crimes, he often minimized them, reframing himself as a lovable rogue who simply got carried away. His comedic timing softened the edges, turning financial predation into an edgy anecdote. Audiences laughed. Hosts played along. It was easier, after all, to celebrate the wolf than confront the horror he represented. But occasionally, in the silence between edits, his eyes betrayed something, a flicker of calculation, a cold awareness that the world's admiration was yet another marketplace he could exploit. Even psychologists began studying Jordan as a case example not of genius, but of extreme narcissism. His ability to charm crowds, they noted, came from the same psychological traits that allowed him to deceive investors without remorse. To him, people weren't individuals with lives and dreams. They were levers, each one a button he could push, so long as it yielded a desired outcome. One psychologist put it bluntly, Jordan Belfort doesn't believe in victims, he believes in opportunities. And when a man sees the world through that lens, morality becomes not a boundary but an inconvenience. But the consequences of Stratton Oakmont didn't fade. Families who lost everything had to start over in middle age, working jobs far below their qualifications. Couples divorced under the weight of financial ruin. Some victims spiraled into depression. A few never recovered emotionally or economically. Their stories rarely made headlines because tragedy doesn't sell as well as charm. While Jordan flew across the world, first class, some of the people he destroyed clipped coupons, took extra shifts, or lived quietly in the shadow of one catastrophic decision. To them, the word wolf didn't sound glamorous. It sounded like a warning growled too late. Federal documents later revealed something even darker. The restitution Jordan was ordered to pay didn't always reach victims promptly, partly because of legal loopholes, partly because Jordan's income was structured in ways that allowed him to keep more than he deserved. Despite public claims of wanting to do the right thing, he consistently fought to reduce payments, restructured assets, and disputed earnings he clearly possessed. It was a slow, grinding re-victimization, each delayed payment a reminder that even after prison, the wolf still controlled the narrative-bending rules just as he always had. In the midst of this, an unsettling trend emerged online. Young entrepreneurs, influencers, and hustlers began quoting Jordan as if he were a prophet. Clips of his motivational speeches went viral. His aggressive sales techniques were adopted by manipulative online gurus. His quotes appeared on Instagram pages preaching hustle culture. A decade earlier, he was a cautionary tale. Now he was a blueprint. Some even argued that he wasn't wrong, that the world punished honesty and rewarded audacity. These people didn't see his victims. They saw his results. And in a society obsessed with winning, morality became optional. Still, for all the applause and adoration, Jordan faced moments where the facade slipped. In one recorded talk, a man in the audience quietly asked, "Do you ever think about the people who lost everything?" Jordan's smile faltered for half a second, just long enough for the mask to tremble before he pivoted into a punchline about learning from mistakes. But for a moment, the room sensed the truth. Remorse was not a language he spoke. Regret to Jordan was useful only when it generated sympathy or sales. His public persona was a performance, his private conscience a void. But the world didn't demand remorse. It demanded entertainment. And Jordan delivered, thriving on the strange intersection where charisma and crime meet applause. Interviews, books, coaching programs, every avenue of modern fame became another revenue stream. He sold success to the same demographic he once scammed, a bitter irony lost on many of his fans. Some of them didn't even know he had gone to prison. Others didn't care. They saw the movie before they saw the man. And Hollywood, intentionally or not, had sanitized him, scrubbing away the human wreckage and leaving only the thrill. Yet the illusion couldn't hide everything. In moments outside the spotlight, Jordan was reported to be irritable, impatient, and fiercely protective of his image. He sued critics for defamation, argued with journalists, and clashed with former employees who challenged his narratives. He built his new empire the same way he built the old one, not on transparency, but on manipulation. And though the stakes were different, the pattern remained eerily familiar. Once again, Jordan wasn't selling truth. He was selling the version of himself that people wanted to buy, the charming devil, the misunderstood genius, the wolf who claimed he had grown a conscience. But the truth was simpler: wolves don't change. They adapt. As the years passed and the world became noisier, Jordan's legacy began to warp into something even more unsettling. To many, he was no longer a criminal who orchestrated one of the most destructive pump-and-dump operations in American history. Instead, he became a symbol of beating the system, a modern outlaw whose charisma overshadowed the human cost of his actions. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was the gradual erosion of collective memory, a societal decision to embrace the spectacle and ignore the suffering. In classrooms, students discussed him as if he were a case study in marketing genius rather than financial predation. In boardrooms, executives referenced his sales mastery instead of the ruined lives he left behind. The wolf hadn't just evaded justice, he had infiltrated culture. But if you listened closely, really listened, you would hear the quiet voices of the people whose futures were rewritten by his manipulation. One woman, now in her late 70s, spoke in a documentary about how she once believed she would retire near the ocean. After losing her savings to Stratton Oakmont, she ended up working part-time at a grocery store, too proud to tell her children the truth. A middle-aged man recounted how he hid the collapse of his investments from his family for months, hoping the stock would recover. It never did. His marriage eventually dissolved under the financial and emotional strain. These stories did not trend online. They didn't become memes or movie scenes. They were simply the unglamorous aftermath, the kind of pain that never sells tickets. Economists later analyzed the ripple effect Stratton Oakmont had on market trust. When thousands of small investors were crushed by pump-and-dump frauds, confidence in legitimate financial institutions dropped as well. Savings accounts shrank as risk-averse individuals became terrified of investing. Communities lost local wealth, middle-class dreams were delayed, downsized, or destroyed. In essence, Jordan's empire didn't just harm individuals, it weakened the fabric of financial stability for everyone. And yet the image that endured was not the devastation, but the celebration, the parties, the drugs, the bravado. The wolf had done more damage than most criminals ever could, yet walked out the other side as if he'd merely taken a joyride. For many psychologists, the Wolf of Wall Street phenomenon became a case study in glamorized immorality. Why do people admire a man who openly boasts about exploiting the vulnerable? The answer was uncomfortable because he represents the fantasy of unrestrained desire, the life people want when they believe the rules don't apply to them. Jordan offered a dangerous dream: wealth without ethics, success without conscience, indulgence without consequences. And for a society that often measures value through financial triumph, that dream was seductive, too seductive. His very existence became a critique of our values, exposing a terrifying truth. We don't just tolerate wolves, we feed them. Yet behind the seductive fantasy lay something profoundly hollow. People who attended Jordan's seminars often described a temporary rush, an intoxicating belief that success was just one pitch away. But after the applause faded and the lights dimmed, they found themselves asking the same question: if Jordan couldn't build an empire without lies, what made them think they could? His teachings weren't strategies for growth. They were echoes of manipulation, relics of a man who succeeded only because he exploited systemic loopholes and human fragility. In the end, those who idolized him didn't learn how to become wealthy, they learned how to desire shortcuts. Meanwhile, some of Jordan's former employees tried to rebuild their lives. Those who had cooperated with the FBI faced social stigma, financial hardship, and years of therapy to cope with the guilt of deceiving innocent people. Others struggled to find new jobs due to their criminal records. A few sank into depression, blaming themselves more harshly than any court ever could. And yet, in a cruel twist of irony, the man who had led them into the darkness became richer and more adored than ever. Their suffering was permanent. His consequences were temporary. This was the most haunting imbalance of all. Legal analysts pointed out how the justice system failed to treat white-collar crime with the seriousness it deserved. If Jordan had stolen a fraction of that amount through physical robbery, he would have likely spent decades behind bars. But financial crimes, complex paper-based, seemingly victimless, often receive lighter sentences despite causing deeper, longer-lasting devastation. Jordan's 22-month stay in a minimum security facility symbolized not just his personal escape, but the broader reality that those who harm through wealth often suffer less than those who harm through force. It was a moral hierarchy written into the very structure of punishment. Some journalists tried to push back against the mythologizing. They wrote investigative pieces detailing the continuing financial struggles of victims, the slow restitution payments, and the manipulative marketing of Jordan's post-prison ventures. But the truth struggled to compete with the spectacle. Stories about ruined retirements received a few thousand views. Clips of Jordan telling outrageous drug stories received millions. Outrage couldn't keep pace with entertainment. And in this imbalance, the wolf thrived once more, feeding on attention as eagerly as he once fed on investor money. Even years after the film's release, young entrepreneurs would approach Jordan at events with admiration in their eyes. They didn't see a criminal. They saw a mentor. "You inspired me," they would say. "You made me want to sell." It was a chilling reminder of how easily society rewrites villains into anti-heroes, how quickly charisma can sanitize destruction. Jordan would smile, shake hands, pose for photos, each fan another brick in the empire of attention he had built. An empire not founded on trust, but on spectacle. And in a world obsessed with virality, spectacle was more valuable than truth. But beneath all the noise, one question remained, a question too large to ignore and too uncomfortable for most to confront. Why did we as a society choose to elevate a man who symbolized the very worst parts of ourselves? Perhaps because Jordan Belfort didn't merely exploit individuals, he exposed humanity's deepest flaw. He showed that greed can be entertaining, that confidence can overshadow ethics, and that charisma can blind us to cruelty. And perhaps the real horror in this story is not that Jordan existed, but that he succeeded, not despite his sins, but because of them. In the end, the wolf did not deceive us. We invited him in. In the aftermath of his rise, fall, and resurrection, Jordan Belfort became a paradox that scholars, psychologists, and ethicists continued to grapple with. He was a criminal who built his fortune on deception, yet he stood on prestigious stages teaching ethics and sales. He was a man ordered to repay $110 million to his victims, yet he lived a lifestyle more comfortable than many middle-class families. He was a cautionary tale told in hushed tones by financial regulators, yet a hero shouted loudly across social media by those who valued swagger over substance. Jordan existed in two dimensions at once, punishment and praise, infamy and fame. And inside that contradiction was a revelation about the world, one far more disturbing than anything he ever did. One former victim once said, "It wasn't the money I lost that broke me. It was the feeling that nobody cared." Her words cut deeper than any financial statistic, because she was right. Society had moved on. The film made billions laugh. The book sold millions. The wolf became a pop culture icon. But the victims, ordinary men and women, were forgotten like background characters in a story they unwillingly funded. Their suffering didn't trend. Their outrage wasn't marketable. They were ghosts haunting the edges of a narrative that had chosen to glamorize the villain instead of honoring the truth. And their silence revealed the most painful truth: the world forgives charisma faster than it remembers pain. In financial ethics courses, Stratton Oakmont is now referenced as a prime example of how unchecked greed can devastate not just markets, but psychological trust. Professors warn students about the dangers of persuasive power, the ethical responsibilities of brokers, and the fragile relationship between investor and advisor. Yet even as the lesson is taught, something else lingers beneath the surface, an unspoken tension between admiration and warning. Some students secretly admire the audacity. They see Jordan not as a criminal, but as someone who played the game better. And in that quiet admiration hides the seed of the next wolf waiting for a chance to grow. Regulators, on the other hand, continue to battle a problem larger than Belfort himself. Stratton Oakmont wasn't just one company, it was a blueprint for thousands of future scams. Boiler rooms multiplied, online fraud evolved, crypto schemes, fake trading platforms, sham investment gurus, they all borrow from Jordan's psychology of deception. Every time a new scam destroys lives, echoes of Stratton can be heard, and the methods used, the language spoken, the dreams exploited. Jordan didn't just commit a crime, he pioneered a method. And in doing so, he unintentionally trained a generation of predators. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of all is how seamlessly Jordan adapted to the digital age. With the internet, he gained access to millions. His persona spread across like TikTok clips, YouTube shorts, motivational reels, bite-sized doses of charisma stripped of context. Young people scrolling for inspiration saw a confident man talking about success, not a criminal, describing the aftermath of fraud. Algorithms rewarded his energy, not his truth. His lines, once evidence of predatory manipulation, became motivational quotes printed on posters. The wolf no longer needed a boiler room. He had something more powerful, an audience that didn't know or care about the bodies buried beneath the story. Still, there are moments, rare, almost imperceptible, when the gleam fades. In certain interviews, when pressed about his past, Jordan's facade cracks for just a heartbeat. His smile tightens, his eyes drift. He leans back as if putting distance between himself and the truth. For a single second, he looks like a man aware of the wreckage behind him. But the moment always passes. He shifts back into performance mode, delivering jokes, anecdotes, and polished insights. Jordan has lived so long inside the myth of the wolf that he may no longer know where the story ends and the man begins. Or perhaps, more chillingly, he does know and prefers the myth. Some believe Jordan's story proves that charisma is a currency more powerful than honesty. Others believe it's a warning that the world is not fair, that consequences are uneven, and that justice bends under the weight of wealth and personality. But there is another interpretation, one far more uncomfortable. Jordan's success exposes something in human nature that many would rather ignore: the desire to escape limitations, to live without consequence, to embrace ego indulgence and rebellion. People don't admire what Jordan did. They admire what he represented. He was the embodiment of a fantasy freedom from morality. And fantasies once rooted in desire are nearly impossible to uproot. Looking back now, decades after the fall of Stratton Oakmont, the question is no longer, how did Jordan Belfort get away with it? The real question is, why did we let him? Because in a world that rewards entertainment over honesty, confidence over integrity, and spectacle over substance, the wolf didn't have to sneak in through the back door. We opened it, we cheered for him as he walked through, we handed him the microphone, the book deals, the movie adaptations, the stages of the spotlight, and we convinced ourselves it was harmless because it was entertaining. But the victims he left behind, those whose lives never recovered, know that entertainment has a cost, and they were the ones who paid it. Jordan Belfort is still out there today, smiling, speaking, selling, not stocks this time, but stories crafted to teach, to inspire, to persuade. And in a strange twist of fate, he is once again doing what he has always done best, using his voice to profit from belief. Only now the belief is willing. The crowds listen, the audiences clap, and the legend grows. The world sees him as a wolf-turned-philosopher, a rogue-turned-mentor. But strip away the polish, the lights, the applause, and what remains is the same truth. As in the beginning, Jordan Belfort didn't change. The world did. And that is the final horror of this story. The Wolf of Wall Street didn't conquer us with violence or fear. He conquered us with charm. He showed that greed could be seductive corruption, could be glamorous, and crime, if told well enough, could be entertainment. In the end, Jordan Belfort is not merely the villain of this tale. He is the mirror we don't want to face, reflecting the parts of society that celebrate style over substance, profit over principle, wolves over the wounded. Perhaps he is right about one thing: he was guilty of being greedy, but so, in some quiet way, are we. And maybe that is why he got away with it. Not because he outsmarted the world, but because the world wanted him to.